Guerra por Agua, Zona Marginal, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we continue with Jeff Dunn, the Associated Press national writer, co-author of this investigative series on pharmaceuticals in our drinking water around the country, whether we're talking about anticonvulsants or antidepressants, mood stabilizers. What about steroids given to cows and animals, Jeff?
Well, this is a whole nother avenue by which these drugs enter our water stream. Animals are given all kinds of drugs. Veterinary drugs are given to animals on farms. All kinds of antibiotics, all kinds of growth-promoting drugs are given to animals on farms. And these drugs eventually run off in rain and end up in the groundwater and in surface waters, and they're a whole nother large source of these pharmaceuticals that enter into the waste stream. Many of them are a lot like, or even in some cases, identical to human drugs. Some of them are different. In San Francisco, you write that there's a sex hormone. What is it? Estrone in the water. What is that? How does that affect people? These are used in hormone treatments and that women take at menopause and such. And the concern with sex hormones is that they're very powerful at even very low levels. So there's been some concern about these kinds of drugs for a longer time, really, than some of the other drugs that were detected in the water. It's been more like 5, 6, 7 years that there's been some concern about sex hormones in the context of other kinds of chemicals that also, though not pharmaceuticals, have the ability to disrupt the human endocrine system. The scientists call them endocrine disruptors. So that's one of the older concerns in this very new field. And the issue of cancer, people who are prone to cancer. That's exactly right. As you probably know, there are certain kinds of cancers that are prone to estrogen, and there is some concern that these kinds of pharmaceuticals, even in trace amounts, could possibly contribute to cancer. And even as we begin to talk a little bit about what the risk is, what the human risk is, there's even a little bit of research in human cells with these drugs at very, very low amounts of the kind that are found in the environment, actually accelerating the growth of human cancer cells. That doesn't mean that they will do that in the human body, but it's just the first scientific hint that perhaps they could. Jeff Dunn, are there standards for drugs in the water around the country? What is the history of how water is protected, how we know what's in it, and what's going to happen now? Well, there are really very few standards for pharmaceuticals. There are no national standards. In fact, the water utilities we surveyed aren't required to even test for them, much less to treat them. The kinds of things that are regulated in the water, and there are many things that are regulated by the federal government in the water, are things where the risk has been established: industrial chemicals, pesticides. People might think of dioxins. There are people might think of lead. There are a lot of chemicals that have known risk to people. Pharmaceuticals at these low levels are a newer kind of contaminant. The risk isn't very well understood yet, though we reported probably for the first time a body of emerging science that suggests that these low amounts could be a danger to people in the sense that they apparently can cause bad things to happen in human cells. And there's probably even a stronger case that these pharmaceuticals in the rivers and streams can cause harm to certain kinds of wildlife, fish. There's some work with low-level antidepressants with mussels and snails that suggest that these kinds of drugs can impair reproduction. So it's just the initial body of evidence that's suggesting that maybe there could be risk, but it's not a slam dunk case like it is for certain industrial chemicals that are fully regulated.
In one of the pieces in the AP investigation, No Standards to Test Drugs in Water, it's written, Congress held hearings in 2006 on endocrine disrupting compounds after researchers discovered that the Potomac River, dotted with sewage treatment plants, contains feminized male bass, which create egg yolk proteins, a process usually restricted to females, but the hearings produced no new proposals.
Yeah, and there were about, by the way, 6 trace pharmaceuticals, 6 different kinds of drugs that were found in the Washington, D.C. area water in the survey we did. So they still have pharmaceuticals in their water. I think it's fair to say that not much in terms of concrete legislation came out of those hearings. People should know that the Senate Committee on the Environment, within hours of the release of our report, announced that it was going to be holding hearings on this whole issue, a much broader approach than the Congressional Committee took earlier. And they are talking about holding hearings on this issue in April.
And it's written, at hospitals, the EPA flags about 3 dozen specific drugs as hazardous waste. They say many hospitals still dump some of these hazardous pharmaceuticals into their other garbage. Also, the list hasn't been updated for years and ignores scores of troublesome newer drugs, including toxic chemotherapy agents.
The EPA says essentially that we can't keep up. Too many new drugs are introduced each year. We've got to base what we do on science. And we simply can't keep up with the number of new drugs that are being introduced on the market in hospitals, much less trying to regulate them in this way at home. So the EPA acknowledged that outright to us.
You also write about the difference between what the U.S. and Europe is doing. After talking about Maine, which is preparing to accept unwanted pharmaceuticals on a grander scale, the federal and state governments have split the $300,000 cost to launch a 4-county trial in coming months where pharmaceutical buyers will take home prepaid mailers to send drug leftovers to a weigh station, where most will be picked up for transport to incinerators. Drug pollution stirs more anxiety in Europe, Canada, and Australia. Why is that, and what is being done right now in Congress?
It is true that Europeans have been on the cutting edge of this, in some cases more than American researchers even. They picked up on it earlier, recognized it as a potential threat earlier. Some of the best early research was done in Germany, for example. So they're a little more concerned about it, and they have national programs of a kind that we don't have to recapture some of these pharmaceuticals that are discarded. This is the issue we were talking about earlier with people having to throw away some of their medicines that have expired and they're not using for some reason. So the French, for example, have had a program for some years where when you get medicine, you also get a prepaid mailer to send it back to the pharmacy if you don't use it, and that's eventually sent for incineration if it goes back to the pharmacy. And there was a poll done a couple years ago, and most French said they took part in that program. They participated in it. So it's not a strange idea to the Europeans. There's still limited regulation in other places, in Europe, in Canada, in Australia. So there's this greater awareness, there's this greater concern, but there's still limited regulation and limited evidence on how great a concern this should be.
Also, bottled water not even tested for any of this.
That's right. A lot of people think instinctively that, well, I drink bottled water, I don't have anything to worry about. As you say, the people in the bottled water industry acknowledge to us that they're not required to test for it. They don't test for these low amounts of pharmaceuticals. And by the way, I should say that we're talking about parts in billion or parts in trillion, very, very low amounts. They don't test for them, and as I said before, there's research showing that these trace pharmaceuticals can end up in groundwater. So part of that bottled water on the market is actually repackaged tap water. You have to remember. And then part comes from underground water sources, but since there's research that suggests that underground water sources can also carry these trace pharmaceuticals and their byproducts, and since testing isn't done, bottled water isn't necessarily devoid of these contaminants either, I'm afraid to say.
Senator Lautenberg, Senator Boxer, Lautenberg of New Jersey, Boxer of California, your investigation has prompted calls for regulation and documentation of these drugs. Can you tell us what these senators are doing?
That's right. There's the